Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first panel of Strand 2 of the Working Class Academics Conference. My name is Ian Duckett and I'm chairing this panel. I was one of the contributors at last year's conference and really enjoyed it, so I've agreed to be a panel chair this time round. I'm not an academic. What bits of research I've done are action research. Lots of people tell me I'm not working class anymore as well, but I still feel I'm working class. So although perhaps I'm phony in some respects, I do feel I can chair the panel by dint of my involvement with the working class academics in the past. And I'm going to say more about each of the contributors to our panel before they speak. But I just first of all want to say hello to Alex, Dunedin, Adam Poole, Michael Hepworth, and Nick Stevenson. And we're going to move straight into our first contributor, which is Alex Dunedin. Alex is an independent reader. He's interested in the development of methods and means that are resilient to appropriation of finance and cults of status. And he runs the Ragged University, which is based very much on the principles of the Ragged schools of the past. So welcome, Adam and Alex, sorry, and over to you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm gonna, let's see, share my screen and take you through this presentation. Right, okay. Right, so today, I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of a piece of work that I will be publishing post the conference. There's a lot in it, and it's an extension from last year's presentation. So it's a continuation of the work last year, and you can see that, read that presentation and see my oral presentation on the Working Class Academics website. This link leads to the written presentation. I'm using working class in a particular way, which I defined last year, and to recap briefly, I'm talking about permissions and allowances as demarcations of status. A category which refers to socioeconomic status, and I will also make reference to leisure class, which has choice and allocates resources, permissions, and allowances. So here's a visual for you. The further to the left, you have performers for sufficiency. Very much situations where one has fewer choices, and to the right, you've got allocators of sufficiency, tend to be owners of enterprises, and they have choices. You know, am I going to take this job? Nah, I'll choose a better job. I'll wait for something better to come. So this is how I'm using the language here. And I'm interested in talking about the implicit bias we find in culture, and what's the story that I want to tune into is Pete Wilkinson's story, and he describes himself as a lorry driver from Deptford, and I went to listen to him speak, and he spoke about his experiences a long time back of leaving Friends of the Earth in order to create an organization which allowed him to do something other than make tea, you know, or give him a bit of responsibility to act on his very passionate connection with the environment. And he spoke of being an outsider in a classist organization, where you had to be an Oxbridge type to get the opportunity and responsibility he felt he needed and deserved. His autobiography details this. So I'm interested in the cultural stereotypes which overwhelmingly structure the opportunities that people get. I'm interested in analysing the elitist and exclusionary behaviours which are codified into the bureaucratic and organisational structures as implicit bias. And I'm also interested in examining in-group and out-group behaviours as cults of status. And a really paradox of the human experience, I guess, is I'm interested in exploring how systems reproduce themselves. It's a question similar to asking, why do people who have been bullied sometimes go on to bully others? You know, how do behaviors recreate themselves? How do systems recreate themselves? That I'm going to be writing up post the conference. So environmental crisis is the context that I'm going to be talking about here. But this we can talk about healthcare, law, business, pick an area of society, whatever it is, education. And I think the same structures and implicit bias can be found. In environmental terms, we're in a time where our health and lifespan and well-being are really being impacted. Multinational companies are really destroying the environment. Fossil fuels are a frank disaster, whether you think you look at the toxicological the toxicity of burning fossil fuels. It's a disaster. We've got pesticides, herbicides, fungicides coming through our food chain and in our environment. Our food chain is becoming devoid of micronutrients, and we're exposed to metabolic diseases. We're losing green spaces, which we've co-evolved with for tens of millions of years. All of this we're viscerally connected to, and people experience this in their own lives. And I'm interested in seeing how that is pseudo narratives are emerging as environmentalism and sustainability gains traction and is recognized as important. The usual suspects move in to agential positions, key positions. So the pseudo representations I'm talking, you can look through the press, in The Guardian, we find questions like, why are Britain's green movements an all-white affair? Well, it's because people who aren't white have been thinking and living with these things for, it's not an all-white affair. Online, the conversation saying save environmental from posh crusties is working class issue 2, towards a working class environmentalism from the New Republic. Does ID magazine, does a climate change movement have a class problem? Well, no. People have been living with these issues for a long time, and have been caring about these things. When I hear people say, oh, well, humus is a middle class thing. Well, no, I lived on a sink estate and was introduced to world foods long before it was packaged and sold with a lifestyle branding that said this belongs to a particular identity. So these sort of representations I'm questioning. Environmental crisis, everybody's involved. The collective problems necessarily involve everybody because they're disasters and catastrophes that are affecting us all. And everybody is invested if we examine it closely in real life outside of the press, really. As issues of the environment and sustainability that grow in status, they are apportioned more resources. Money is flowing to these areas and agency and status. There's a clustering around positions of agency and importance of the privileged, you know. We can demonstrate this trend. The patterning recreates a mythology which is used to justify self-reinforcing, class-ridden, hierarchical society of exceptionalism and prerogative. And all of this, there's a whistle-stop tour of these statements that I'm backing up with the research that I invite everybody to critique. And you know, I think colonization and overshadowing is we're witnessing. Well-known sociologist Norbert Elias offers interesting insights in the work The Established and the Outsiders. I think there's very interesting articulations of how the monopolization of associational and other local key positions by members of connected and like-minded, like-thinking families is characteristic that we see again and again in old families' networks, and how governance structures tend to be governed by people who have good access to resources or are well-heeled in terms of status, and that displaces people who have been doing activities all along. The third sector is we see is a professionalization of things that people have been doing in their lives regardless for a long time. The psychology of infrahumanization maps well to Scott's and Elias's work. This is modern psychological research on dehumanization. And infrahumanization talks about the preferential attribution of certain humanizing characteristics to in-group behaviors. I'm also looking at homophily, sociological research on how essentially birds of a feather flock together. And there's a tendency for friendships to form between those who are alike in various respects. There's research showing that bonds and ties form between people who are share socioeconomic status, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of activities, shared activities. Being face to face is an important part of making bonds, and if you can't go on that world tour or trip to the Seychelles, well, you're not going to have the conversations, and you're not going to be a part of each other's lives. So there's a self-reinforcing thing that goes on with homophily. I'm very interested in Professor Dijkman's work on cult behaviors which run through our society, and the four principles he puts together. These are the characteristics he finds again and again in cults that he has examined. The compliance with the group, dependence on a leader, devaluing the outsider, and avoiding dissent. So I think these are interesting to me about how class recreates itself, privilege recreates itself. Groups become impermeable to outsiders, and exclusionary practices happen, and exclusionary practices become codified into bureaucratic practices, and people who administer and govern those bureaucratic practices are sourced from junctures that are defined by the bureaucratic practices. So if you've got a degree from Oxford or Cambridge, you're welcomed into, say, an organization. This is an old quote from Pete Wilkinson, but if he had gone to Oxford or Cambridge, he felt he would have been given a gential position. And if you've got no qualifications like myself, well, how I might get to sweep up a floor. But what if I've got a theory about trophobiosis and how pesticides are depleting oh, that's my time. What if I've got major contributions to areas that demarcate me out of stuff? And if you look at the statute of apprentice artificers, this is the introduction of qualifications, the demarcation of who can be in certain controlled professions. I'm going to finish quickly on a paradox of organization, and Nazima Kadir, who wrote about hierarchies and authority in the squatter movement in Amsterdam, and how the squatters movement organization, the PVKers, organized themselves into a hierarchy which started to evict squatters. So, yeah, how is our society, class-ridden society, recreating itself is a major feature of the write-up that I'm going to be doing. Thanks very much for listening. I hope that's an interesting whistle-stop tour. Thanks, Ian, for your patience.
Thanks very much, Alex. Fascinating talk. I should have said at the start, we're going to take questions to all panelists at the end. So I would invite people to put any questions in the question and answer session. There is one already in there for Alex. So I'd also suggest if people the speakers want to answer in writing before question time, that's also fine, because there is an option to provide a written answer, or if you'd rather wait till the end and do that. Also, just before Alex spoke, I was reading the Morning Star, and there's a very good article in this morning's edition, which chimes with what you're saying, by Matt Trinder, on the kind of growing inequality in British society, particularly since the beginning of the pandemic. So well worth a look at that if anybody's interested, and I guess you all are interested. That's why you're here. So please have a look at that if you get the chance. Going to move almost seamlessly on to our second speaker, and that's Nick Stevenson. Nick is a reader in cultural sociology at the University of Nottingham, and he's going to speak to us about class critical pedagogy and the politics of English heritage. So over to you, Nick.
Many thanks for organising this, everybody. I'm enjoying it and looking forward to meeting people later on. I've been thinking about museums and heritage for some time now, but the place I want to start is a bit close to home. I'm just going to hold up a photograph. I don't know if you'll be able to see this person here. Okay, this is where I want to start. Okay, just so you can see that image. My thoughts on this topic are heavily shaped by my grandfather, William, who you've just seen in that photograph there. Like many working class families of the 1960s, 1970s, it's not unusual to have grandparents who are literally living in families' front rooms. So the front room, if you don't know, for working class people of that period, was the place where you put your nice furniture, and generally people didn't go into. So there was a strong sense that we didn't really ever know what it was for until my grandfather moved into it. And in many respects, as someone who then later went to university and became very interested in history, which I still am, my grandfather William is the first historian that I ever met. He was literally full of stories of the past. He skillfully connected his own life to the lives of, and my life, to the lives of mill workers, railway workers, stretching all the way back to the late 1800s. So this was often this is a stories about family. It was about place. All these people were from Derby, which is my hometown. It was about nation, and quite often it was about, and also it was about class. And the stories he told me interconnected the personal and the political. Okay, the personal and the public as well, I think. And when he died, he left me a pocket watch that had been given to him on his retirement from the railway in the 1970s. William then was a labour supporting trade unionist who kept a garden, certainly as he'd often say to me, so the bosses can't starve you back to work, who taught me the values of community and of collective struggle. And it's the meaning of his life and what he stood for, what his particular generation stood for, where I've been thinking about quite a lot as I've been visiting what you might roughly call various kinds labour history museums. And it's no longer clear, to me at least, where you would find these sorts of stories now, other than through families. So if you look at the current debates in the so-called heritage industry, you hear two main things, I think, and I'm, massively oversimplifying, but this will have to do for now. Firstly, there's a sort of, kind of very well-known, I think, conservative project, which is about stately homes, aristocratic landscapes, sort of Downton Abbey, I suppose, which belongs to a fairly small but hegemonic ruling class which still exists. The second is a sort of politics of identity, where the heritage sector seeks to open up new narratives, particularly around race and ethnicity, colonial conquest, and so on. And both of these narratives have its place. I'm not trying to get rid of any of them there. They're important, but there's something that's missing from that, I think. And here I just want to think about something that Richard Hoggart has written about museums. I know Richard Hoggart's not a terribly fashionable author these days, but I still like him. And he argues in this fairly short piece that he wrote about museums that what a museum should be is contributing to what he called a civilized democracy, which will not abuse culture for mere immediate political ends, nor impose its own predetermined definition of culture on its people. It will be open, demotic, not bullying, not endlessly relativist, populist, or trivial. It will offer perspectives on the better and the best. Its people will be free to be both inside and outside of their cultural overcoats. And I often find that these kind of sentiments are often getting lost in what you might call the current sort of cultural wars, which are making their way through the arts and heritage organisations today. That in the competition to impose meanings, quite often, what gets lost is a more sort of what I would call a kind of civic nationalist type project, which recognises the historical emergence of democracy and the public realm that was literally built by the direct participation of the organised working class, which developed other forms of human flourishing beyond a kind of narrow nationalism. Civic nationalism, I think, offers you something different, and free market economics. What these zones could offer, or what they should offer, are national zones of interconnection and dialogue, distant from a populist language of certitude, and they should open up, if you like, spaces of discussion where people can communicate, if you like, experiences across the generations. And I think that that's being lost at the moment. So what's at stake here is, you know, kind of cultural meaning, but also how the labour movement, I think, helped shape our national institutions, like the NHS, the education system, public libraries, trade unions, etc. Most of which came for the struggle for those things came actually from below. And in terms of the current heritage debates, you will very rarely hear this particular sort of perspective. It's almost entirely absent. If we go back to Hoggart's, that short quotation that I gave you from him, one of the things he does is basically to think about, well, what kind of spaces should they be? Firstly, they should refuse populism. They should refuse the kind of easy answers, or museums that simply just pander to the public, or kind of well-heeled donors. They shouldn't be pedantic. They should offer up different views of the past, different understandings of the past. They should be a place of civic engagement where it doesn't simply seek to impose the correct interpretations. Thirdly, they need to be democratic. That is, there needs to be a complexity of dialogue, and you can't get that in spaces which are, you know, overly dogmatic or simply seen as tourist attractions. And fourthly, there should be places of difficult learning where powerful and contested memories can, you know, resist the sort of allure, I think, of nostalgia. Now, that is all a great deal for our institutions, our museums to live up to, but I still think there are places where you can see these sorts of things happening. But in quite a lot of the places that I visited, there's also a sense of a kind of missed opportunity, I think. So I'm just going to give you a few examples now, because I know I haven't got long. I can't talk about all the places I've been to and visited, but just a few of them. So there's a place called in Ruddington, which is near me. It's just called the Framework Knitters Museum. And here you have really the beginnings of the labour movement. You have a story which tells of revolts in Nottinghamshire of the Stockingers who became involved in Luddism. However, the pastness of the story is poorly connected to the present. Other than local pride, which is clearly, you know, important, what you don't then get is how this then gets connected into, say, something like Peterloo and Chartism and so on. You also don't get any idea of how the labour history of the past can be connected to something you might call the active present. There's very little sort of attempt to connect it to sort of labour struggles of today and so on. So it just ends up just simply being about a record of a particular time and a particular place. The element of dialogue is kind of missing. Also, if you go to the People's History Museum in Manchester, which is a fantastic place, I'd suggest that you visit it if you've not done so. It's a really important institution that needs to be protected and maintained. Here you do get a real sense of an ongoing idea of working class struggle. There's a narrative of democratization, which begins with Peterloo, into Chartism, then into the post-war period. This is kind of interrupted by the rise of Thatcherism and the new right in the 1980s. But there is a real sense of, a sort of history from below. But it does tend, there is a sense though in this kind of progress narrative that it tends to give about kind of ongoing democratization, the importance of taking up struggles and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. And so it's some of the more complex stuff kind of tends to get sort of sidelined. So for example, there's one image which I'm sure most of you will know, which comes from the miners' strikes, the famous image of the journalist Leslie Bolton, who's being struck by a policeman on a horse. Okay, some of you hopefully will remember that. But what they don't do is then link this to the Orgrave campaign for justice and the demand for a kind of public inquiry that wants to kind of look at what some of the things that happens there. How does this layer of the past then, linger in the present? One of the unresolved threads of history that continue to find expression in the lives of the living. So I suppose then in the work that I've been trying to do, these are the things that I kind of want to raise and want us to think about. I think that these industrial museums or the histories of working class struggle in context of museums is still an enormous opportunity. These are still really important spaces. Why? In terms of the present, number one, I think they offer something beyond a politics of disconnected individualism. There is really a striking lack of interest in the past now in our society. I've really noticed this as I've got older. I teach sociology professionally in a university. Students have very little knowledge or very little awareness of the past. They don't feel themselves to be connected to it at all, really. And it's partly because of this culture, I think. This culture of it's all about the individual. Although obviously in the pandemic, everyone's discovered it isn't just all about the individual, is it? There is actually now such a thing as a society. But what's interesting is people don't generally feel still there's a sense of responsibility towards others and or to remember the lives of people who came before them. There's a sense of this disconnected individualistic culture, which simply insists that we're all consumers, aren't we? Secondly, I think there's this hegemonic idea of national heritage, which is still there. This idea I started off with of Downton Abbey, stately homes, the lives of sort of aristocrats and so on. That's still fairly sort of dominant, and it persists in writing out working class people who have been the active participants in building a democratic participatory society, which is of course less than perfect. Here we perhaps need to remember the work of Raymond Williams when he talked about the idea of the long revolution. It's not over yet. This sort of struggle for a more democratic, a more equal world is not over. It's still there, okay? And we need these museums to remind us of this. The struggles that the lives of previous generations undertook on our behalf to make a better world are still important, still need to be actively remembered. Now this, I think, is different from a politics of nostalgia, because in many, I've talked about these things in the past, people immediately accuse you of being nostalgic. And I admit that I do, it's hard to walk around these spaces without a feeling of melancholia. Okay, there is a sense of something that we've lost. There's no doubt about that, I think. What we've lost are the powerful labour movements of the past that, to use Lisa's word from the previous presentation, that gave people like my grandfather an incredible sense of dignity, okay, of the world in which they were actively trying to build beyond the water-torn, kind of history of the 20th century, of building a better society that was potentially coming down the line in the future. And that, this really is, as I say, not really being actively remembered at the moment, or it just seems incredibly absent from the current politics and the ways that politics is understood in terms of the debates that go on in the heritage industry, whether it's at the level of the government or whether it's within some of the kind of current writing and debates that seem to excite everybody's imagination. Class and the remembrance of labour history is almost absent from all of that. So to return then, I'm going to finish now to my grandfather William, who I introduced you to at the beginning, just to show you him again. There he is. He often used to say to me, you only really ever need to read one book. Now, I haven't taken any notice of that, but I just want to draw to attention the one book that he kept on his shelf was a copy of The Rugged Trousered Philanthropist, kept it on his mantelpiece. And this is a book that needs to be taught in our classrooms. It's a taught that it's a history. It has history, ideas that need to be passed along the generations, just as it passed it on to me. But also we need to be educating our young children about the history of their class and of the movements that shaped our common world in which we live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. As a great journey through working class labour, cultural heritage. I loved it. I live in a part of the country where we're very fortunate to have a few of those such places, including one on the Norfolk Broads, which I'd be very happy to show you if you're ever interested in them. It documents, it's an oral history collection that goes back to that part of Norfolk and a particular agrarian way of life, which is different than all others I've ever come across. And before the railways got there. And it's a fascinating and not much visited place, actually, but it's well worth a visit. So thank you very much. As I said earlier on, we will be returning to Nick and the other speakers for questions at the end. But now we'll move seamlessly on to our third speaker. That's Michael Hepworth, who is a senior lecturer in TESOL and education at the University of Sunderland. And he also teaches for the Open University. And Michael's going to speak to us today about challenging neoliberalism in language education.
Hi, good morning. Can everybody see my PowerPoint? Is that coming up? Okay, brilliant. So basically, what I want to talk about today is kind of a bit of pedagogical research that I was involved in as a kind of teacher practitioner, really. So researching my own classroom. So basically, what I want to do is to talk about a classroom-based piece of research, which is influenced by a kind of punk pedagogy. And I worked with a photograph, and I wanted to kind of problematize neoliberalism as a kind of ideology, and to see what happened with the students that I was working with there. So there's an argument that I want to kind of pitch at the same time as kind of describing this project. And the argument is that there's a value in confronting neoliberalism, which is kind of is often assumed. It's the kind of orthodoxy, it's the doxa in many areas, including the area that I work in, which is language education. So English language teaching and learning. So that's the kind of argument that I want to make, that there's a value in confronting this, and that there's a value in critiquing it with a view to perhaps changing it. So basically, my kind of pedagogical and research context is migrant language education. So it's what's sometimes called TESOL. So that's teaching English to speakers of other languages. So basically, I'm going to talk about research that I did in an FE context, so in an FE college in West Yorkshire. And I worked with a group of adult migrants in their kind of 20s and early 30s, basically they were kind of advanced level speakers, so their English was pretty good. So they were able to handle some of the discussion, as you'll see. And basically they were working kind of fairly precarious jobs. They were kind of studying part-time and working part-time. And they were kind of in the service sector. So in terms of the class-based thing, I think that these migrants were quite marginalized, quite silenced, and their voices, you know, they were very much in a kind of working class environment. As are many of the teachers in FE, who are often on precarious contracts and often, you know, quite powerless in relation to kind of existing structures. So that's something about the people that I was working with. Just something very briefly about me. Although I'm kind of influenced by the punk pedagogy thing, I wouldn't say I was a punkademic. I'm more of a kind of old style lefty. So a socialist, a trade unionist, and somebody who kind of sees that as an important part of my identity, something that I want to bring into the classroom, and something that I want my students to kind of discuss in some way. So that's the kind of context in which I went into my own classroom and wanted them to work with neoliberalism. I should also say that the world of English language, the world of TESOL and English language teaching and learning is not a radical world. So the idea of dealing with neoliberalism, it is a move in itself. So that there's published material, both in the kind of private world of ELT publishing. There's government material, and there's very, very little that actually deals with explicitly names or deals with neoliberalism in any way, shape, or form. Often, and this is a personal view, professional view, often the materials are quite bland. Often it's about things which are quite uncontroversial. I mean, that helps to sell books, helps to sell ELT textbooks, and it helps on a more cynical level. It helps to avoid the lens being focused upon a neoliberal orthodoxy. Okay, so that's my classroom. That's the kind of backdrop to the research that I did. So I'm just going to share a little bit about what I took in and what I found, and then kind of make some kind of reflections and hopefully stimulate some questions or some debate. So I hope everybody can see. Can everybody see the slides? Is that okay? Are we okay with that? Right, yeah. So I hope you can see that the photograph that I took in, which is a very famous black and white photograph by a chap called Mike Wells. It's entitled Legs. And I took this into the classroom as a kind of pedagogical intervention, because for me, that photograph frames issues around equality under what I would call the neoliberal orthodoxy. And I should say just something very briefly about neoliberalism. I kind of skipped over that bit, which was a mistake. Sorry, I'm just, forgive me for a second, I've jumped ahead. Neoliberalism is about valorizing the market. It's about putting a price on things which basically were never intended to have a price on their head. That includes things like the English language itself. So when you're teaching the English language to those who don't have it as a first language, that's seen as a kind of commodity under neoliberalism. So actually, you know, things are commodified, and the market is the king, and the market is the way that we should organize things. So this is what I wanted to kind of challenge. So before I get onto the photograph, sorry, I jumped ahead there a little bit. I want to say something about punk pedagogy. Now punk pedagogy is many things, but just very briefly, I want to kind of understand it and to kind of characterize it in terms of a particular lens. So it's critical. So it's critical of neoliberal discourse. It's critical of power structures as they exist at the moment. So political and economic power structures in education, in the workplace. It's anti-authoritarian. It tries to flatten out hierarchies. So, for example, in a classroom context, it tries to flatten out hierarchies between teacher and students. It's not about competition, it's about community. It's about authenticity, and it's about trying to give a voice to those who are kind of silenced or dispossessed in some way. And migrants to the UK, not exclusively and not always, but often fall into that category of kind of a very kind of silenced population. So punk's very visual. So it kind of suited the idea that I wanted to go in with, the idea around a photograph and using that and trying to use that to kind of open up areas around neoliberalism. And it often kind of represents the marginalized, and it has a kind of DIY ethic, which is basically nobody's going to do it for you, so you have to get on and do it yourself. So that there are a number of things there that are important. So for me as a teacher, taking in this photograph by Mike Wells was a way of me doing it myself and trying to generate my own kind of curriculum with the students rather than having it imposed upon us, which is sometimes often what happens. We're told what to teach. We're often told these days as well, of course, how to teach it. So in a kind of in a spirit of punk, in a spirit of critical pedagogy, I wanted to take my own resource because I felt it brought something that we weren't getting from published resources. So the photograph is for me, it frames issues around equality under neoliberalism. So you've got a kind of very famous photograph. I don't know if anybody knows it, but it's of a couple of billboards which were snapped next to each other sometime in either the late 70s or the early 80s by Mike Wells. And basically, I took that in and I showed it to the students in the same way that I'm showing it to you. And I didn't tell them what they had to think about it. The idea was that I kept it open, that I wanted them to tell me what they thought of that photograph. So I kind of framed it in a very open way. What do you think? What do you see? What do you feel? Tell me about what you think about what's going on in this photograph here. Clearly, for me, it had resonance in terms of opening up a critique of neoliberalism. But actually, what I want to present is a little bit of data from the students, from what they said, because I think it raises issues around class and it raises issues around activism and its role in critiquing the neoliberal orthodoxy. So what did I get? Well, I'm going to focus on the contributions of one student. They might not be typical, but this was a kind of small group, and it's kind of qualitative research in the sense that I was interested in exploring in detail kind of individual perspectives on this. So really, one of the students said, well, it's a contrast. There are two opposing ways of living. So they kind of went straight to the heart, actually, of what I shared. That they said that one of them's a commercial, one of them is about the world of capitalism, the world of consumption, a particular world where our value is measured in terms of what we can consume. But actually, the second one that he goes on to say, the second one is you can't dream about that stuff if you don't have basic consumption needs met. In other words, your need for food, your need for basic nourishment. So straight away, he began to kind of unpick what I see as the contradictions, perhaps at the heart of the kind of neoliberal agenda, the idea of that actually it's riven with inequality actually and contradiction. The second quote on the slide there, he talked about consumptionism there. You might call it conspicuous consumption, the idea of that we're encouraged to spend to create demand in a capitalist economy. But on the other hand, we live in a world where people go hungry, not just in a world context, but as we know, in a UK context as well. So actually this student began to kind of unpick this, began to talk about this in quite significant ways. Just to kind of finish with a little bit of data, the really interesting thing, and this is where I think it links to activism, is he talks about actually not just what the situation is, but he talked unprompted about ways in which we can begin to remedy, begin to address these inequalities. So drawing on his own experience as a punk rocker, unbeknownst to me, and as an anarchist, he talked about the movement that he was part of in Poland. He talked about the actions that they took in terms of, you know, taking food that was close to or on its sell-by date and distributing it amongst the homeless. The idea of contributing to various charitable movements in terms of Africa and Ethiopia, which kind of dates this data a little bit. This is going back a few years, this now clearly, but he talked about him as an activist and what he could do to address these inequalities. So actually what the photograph generated in terms of that person was quite a lot of stuff around, you know, this is what neoliberalism is, these are its problems, and this is what we might be able to do about it. So there was quite a lot there, which as a kind of old style lefty, I would say implicates class as a variable, but basically within the context of language education, not just facilitates critique of the system, but actually generated quite a lot of discussion. So it improved the language skills that the students had. So it actually developed things like fluency, that there were lots of extended turns of talk in this debate. The students had a lot to say. We were able to develop a vocabulary to discuss neoliberalism. So things like the market, things like rights, things like contradictions. Yes, at quite an advanced level, because they were advanced level students. So there was a kind of language skill payoff as well. Sorry, I'm just looking at my watch. Have I got about 5 minutes, Ian? Is that right? Or?
Slightly less, but I think we're more or less on time, so we can stretch to 5. I think.
Yeah, I'll finish shortly. So so basically, I kind of I wanted to look at it in terms of the punk thing as well. So Bestley, who writes about kind of graphic design in the context of punk, talks about what he calls détournement, which is a strategy where there's a kind of satirical intervention, a kind of turning round of structures of power through a turning round of images. And I see that happening in the photograph. So what you've got is the kind of image on the left, which is the image of capitalist consumption. The glamorous image, the commodified image, is kind of undermined and undercut by this image of the man with the emaciated legs. So there's a kind of critique of capitalism there, which kind of draws, amongst other things, on a kind of tradition of kind of punk, like a punk lens. So I think it uses various rhetorical strategies, and it pitches an argument in a very interesting way, and we can use punk pedagogy as a kind of lens to look at that. Now, just finally, because I know I'm running out of time, I want to say that that the DIY ethic in punk is just handing control back to students and teachers and taking it away from kind of bureaucrats and policymakers, and that we can create our own curricula, that the people in working class positions can help to create their own destinies. And actually developing a critique of neoliberalism is something that teachers and students can do, even though we're not encouraged to. In the context of language education, we can use it to improve language skills, but also skills of critique. And we can help, finally, to change the world. A grand aim though that might be. So thanks for listening. I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time, and I'm happy to field questions when they come in.
Thank you very much, Michael. I love that piece of action research, and it's linked to the kind of bigger generalizable positions you made. So thanks for that. I would be quite interested in talking to you outside of this, because I'm about to embark upon a small piece of local research that has a few things in common with that. So if you don't mind me dropping you a line.
It'd be my pleasure.
Thank you. So our fourth and final speaker is Adam Poole, who is in Beijing, China, and was experiencing some internet problems earlier on. So if he does experience any further problems, we have got a recording of what he's about to say, which we can switch to if necessary. Adam is a researcher based in, as I said, in Beijing, China, and he is researching schooling, particularly through teachers' lived experience. And his talk includes a word that I never thought that I'd have a chance to say in public as a working class lad growing up around the docks in my hometown, but I spent a lot of time without knowing it among bricoleurs. His talk is entitled "The Working Class Academic as Bricoleur."
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me? So a lot of what I'm going to say actually connects with this idea of punk pedagogy. So I never heard of that term until today, but the idea of the academic, working class academic as the bricoleur is very much connected to DIY and punk pedagogy. So what I'm trying to do is think of a kind of identity for myself as an academic, as a working class academic in a very kind of middle class context, and how to sort of reclaim a sense of authenticity and embrace a sort of working class identity that I think for many years I kind of neglected, or perhaps I was too, I don't know, I had problems with the term working class academics. So this is my attempt to sort of understand it a bit better through the idea of the bricoleur. Okay, so first of all, I like this definition of working class, because for me, it really connects very well. Sorry, my son Henry has just come in. Henry, I'm actually talking right now. I'm trying to say hello to everyone. Darling, I'm doing a presentation, okay? So can I just talk? Sorry about that. So the idea of working class is it's not a problem to be solved. And the idea that a lot of the associations that the working class has, such as accents and savagery and roughness, these are things that should be celebrated and embraced. And for me, these all feed into the idea of the bricoleur. And for me, I've always felt like something of an outsider. But in terms of being in academia, and also, as I'll go on to show in a minute, a little bit in terms of being working class, but I find that quite empowering. So this is my way of actually trying to take this definition of the working class and trying to understand it in terms of perhaps the bricoleur. So the first thing I want to say is why I had some trouble trying to understand myself as working class and sort of not fitting in here nor there. So when I was at school, I was on free school meals, which is often taken as a proxy for working class students. And I kind of, so that makes an assumption about socio-economic status. So these two are put together or conflated. And yeah, we lived, my twin brother and I and my mum, we lived in a flat in a place called Hepworth in Plymouth, which is in the southwest of England. It was very, very rough kind of council estate. And my mum was actually unemployed. So in a way, in my mind, I'm not sure where I belong in terms of class. We're sort of maybe slightly below working class in terms of our economic status. But my mum was sort of from the middle class. And then over time, she became working class after divorcing my dad. So there was a weird sort of disconnect there for me between the economic side and the social side, because the social was very much about books and musical instruments. That. And so from a very age, I always had this sort of issue with identity and labeling. And particularly labeling, I always found a little bit frustrating. So I think this identity that I'm trying to share with you is a way to sort of break that kind of labeling and try to find a new sort of identity. So in order to do that, I want to introduce this idea of the bricolage and the bricoleur. So the best way to understand bricolage is Lego. So my son, Henry, who just walked in, he loves Lego. He loves to build things in random bits. And sometimes he has no idea what he's going to build and the pieces just fall together. And for me, that really encapsulates one of these sort of strengths, perhaps, of being a working class academic, which is illustrated through the idea of the bricoleur, is that you don't quite know what you're going to do. You don't quite know what resources are going to come to hand, but you really make do with the things that you have. So this idea of the bricoleur and the bricolage comes originally from anthropology, from the work of Levi-Strauss. And that was developed by Derrida, and then Denzin, and then I can never say his name, Kinkyo, I'm sorry if I said it wrong. And then more recently, a Chinese, I believe, working class academic who's connected bricolage and the bricoleur to the working class. So part of Levi-Strauss's work is where he gets these two characters. One he calls the engineer, and the other he calls the bricoleur. So in this kind of contrast, I want you to imagine the engineer as your sort of middle-class academic. So according to Levi-Strauss, the engineer is kind of the scientific mind and is characterized as kind of being a craftsman, and they see the project in its complete entirety, and they only create projects according to the tools that they have available. So there's very much a sense of being quite at home and secure in their little world, because they know exactly it's mapped. The terrain is very mapped, they're very comfortable. The thing about the engineer, as say the bourgeois academic, is that it's very much a reductionist process. The idea of like decomposing things into their constituent elements. For me, I'm very much into lived experience, and that's keeping the messiness and the rawness intact. That's the punk aspect of it, I guess. This kind of approach is very much about the scientific approach, which is reifying everything, reducing it, taking it apart, trying to understand it. And one of the things is that the outcomes respond to field norms. So the idea is that the middle class academic is very much at home in their own world, because it's a kind of tautology. To be middle class and academic, there's very much that kind of language and comfort. And then we contrast that with the bricoleur. And so for me, I like to think of the working class academic as the bricoleur. So for Levi-Strauss, the bricoleur, or the bricoleuse, because that's the female form, but it's often used in the masculine, is the savage mind. So the bricoleur is someone who doesn't have all of the resources. Often they're operating in a situation of resource scarcity. And I love this definition where it says they work with their hands in devious ways, and they put pre-existing things together in new ways and make do with whatever is at hand. So for me, this really like resonates with me as a working class academic, the idea that we don't have to accept all of these, ontologies and concepts and things that are handed to us, that we can actually subvert them and play with them. And I think that's a very important aspect, is the idea of play. It doesn't have to be so systematic and rigorous. The idea that you can just try things out and then put them down, move around. And the idea of the academic as a tinkerer, as a jack of all trades, that you don't necessarily specialize in one thing, but you have this kind of, I don't know, this childlike interest in everything. And for me, that's encapsulated by the character of the Doctor, as the 11th Doctor there, Matt Smith, and Jodie Whittaker, I believe, is the 13th Doctor. And that's very much in keeping with the character of the Doctor, where things are picked up and put down, and the Doctor will make do with whatever is at hand. So for me, the bricoleur, very much an identity, I suppose, that that would fit very well with this idea of punk pedagogy and anger and a DIY ethic. So I just want to say a little bit more about how that would kind of fit with a sort of working class academic project. So for me, the working class academic identity is a kind of oppositional identity. It's one where you don't necessarily pay deference or to those received ways of doing things. There is a sense of maybe anger, a sense of perhaps frustration, and a sense of wanting to dismantle things, but not just to destroy them, but to put them back together again. It's a celebration, not an apology. So we come back to that definition at the beginning, where we celebrate those things that are typically seen as being rather negative. What I also like about the idea of the bricoleur and how that could relate to a sort of working class academic identity is that it refuses to be shackled to a center. The engineer is very much the center of their universe, whereas the bricoleur is always trying to elude capture. He or she is always trying to make their own center wherever they are with the things that they have. And I think that's very important for maintaining an identity in a middle-class context where it's so easy to lose your identity. If we imagine that, you are able to make your own center with the things that you have, and that's okay. Those experiences that you bring with you, they're actually absolutely perfect, and there's nothing wrong with them at all. And I kind of realized that the bricolage and the bricoleur has sort of been with me for quite a long time, even before I really understood it. So for example, I've written a little bit about labeling and the way that teachers are often labeled. For example, in international schooling, they're labeled like type A, type B, type C. And again, this is where we see the reduction of lived experience. So the idea is that we're able to shake off those labels, and we are the ones to create our own identities. And I think the bricoleur is a kind of useful identity or guise for doing that. There's also a kind of suspicion of theory and concepts, that we not necessarily have to accept them just because they are from some dead white guys who established this great theory. There is a built-in suspicion there. But I also think it highlights this idea of anxiety of authenticity. For me, it was always like, I want to be accepted as an academic. And then in my mind, I had to sort of displace this idea of being working class. But then authenticity goes both ways, because there's a sense of wanting to be authentic to yourself as, say, a working class academic. And then there's another struggle of authenticity where you want to be recognized as an academic, which I said before is often synonymous with middle class. And I always wrestled with that. And then I finally come to the conclusion, especially with this conference as well, where it's a sense of it's better to be authentic to yourself and to accept that. And that authenticity, I think, will go a very long way. Okay, I'm not really sure about the time, so I kind of lost track of the time. So I'm going to end it there because I'm not 100% sure where I am. Okay, so thank you very much.
That was perfect timing, Adam, actually. Spot on. Thank you for that. And that ends the fourth in our highly original and creative presentations. I've thoroughly enjoyed all four of them. And we've now got about 15 minutes left for questions. the last time I looked in the question and answer books, there were 5 questions. So I'm going to direct them at the individual speakers one at a time, and we'll get through as many as we can. And if we don't get through them all, if you are willing and able to, perhaps you could give a written answer to the ones that we don't get through. So I'm just getting them in front of me now. Sorry, the first question is from is for Alex, and it's from somebody called Schmel, who I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Schmel. How can the problem of relationships between the working class and the academy be best resolved, Alex?
Well, that's an ongoing research project that I'm trying to live out. And if you look at Ragged University, that website shows a lot of histories, a lot of artifacts, of explorations of this. So I personally think we should look to social traditions that are resilient to all manners of hostile well, things that make social practices fragile. So I mentioned, you can see that there's an allusion to the ragged schools, and look up the history of John Pounds. You know, this is a guy in Portsmouth who had a cobbling shop. I think sort of living and creating relationships and understanding that education is about relationships and seeing individuals, not seeing institutions. So there's lots, but that's a very good question. I'm trying to find answers to that, and probably will be all my life.
Right, thank you very much for that, Alex. I do have another question for you, but I'm going to try and get at least one for each of the speakers, and so I may come back to you with a second question. The second question is for Nick, and it comes from Jules, and a very similar question was asked by Jagdish. So I've tried to, or Jagdish probably, I've tried to put them together as best as I can. And the question is, it's around the lack of connectedness, Nick, that you were referring to, and the question is around how can academics, working class or other, I guess, but it's more in our interest as working class academics to do so. How can we address that?
Okay, yeah, well, thank you, Jules and Jagdish. Jagdish, it's good to hear you're here asking me really difficult questions. Well, how can we deal with this sense of disconnectedness? On an individual level, I'm not sure that we can. It's a wider cultural problem that I think that we've got in our society. You know, that this sort of culture of disconnected individualism, I think, is really entrenched. In fact, it's the students that I kind of teach, it's the one culture that they have access to, and they also have a language of identity politics and little else quite often. So quite often I think that one of the things that my job is to try to kind of get them to think about something, and this does come from the sort of culture and traditions in which I was talking about, is of the common good more generally. And if you use those terms, they've never heard of it. Okay, that's something that's completely outside of anybody's experience. So everything I was trying to talk about, I think, was an attempt by a particular generation or generations of people, organize them in particular kinds of ways to make their own lives better, but also to improve the societies within which they happen to find themselves. And it's that sort of story, that kind of narrative, I feel, that's that's sort of missing. The roots of how we become disconnected from the past, how those sorts of things kind of happen. It's quite curious in a way, because if you think about it, on one level, we've never had more access to history than we've got at the moment. You know, our television shows and our computer networks and so on are awash with images of the past. And yet, curiously, we also live in this very sort of nowist culture, that what really happens is what's happening right now, what's on my mobile phone, all those sorts of things, really, which is again why these sort of, what you might call quite often fairly old-fashioned institutions, old-fashioned spaces are so important, because they do evoke a sort of sense of the past. Now, I know that I'm not answering the question, because I don't think there's one sort of easy there's one easy answer to that. It has something, I think, to do with how did I become interested in history? It was partly because my grandfather grew up in the same house, and partly because he was so full of stories and so on. But it was also because when I entered into school, there people did talk about labour history. They did talk about, there was a way of accessing the history of the working class that you could do. You could do A-level subjects on in the kind of industrial past. And I think quite often those things do start with particular localities as well, particular local experiences that you can kind of possibly connect people into. But it has to start with being able to see yourself as being made by the past in some sort of way, of somehow not being disconnected from it. So it could be within family histories, but equally, our schools, museums and so on, they need to do much more on that, rather than simply it being about the traditional politics of heritage, or a kind of identity politics, which I think they're very, very keen on at the moment, both of which have their place. But there should be a space for what I would call a kind of civic nationalist project as well, which I know that is not popular with everybody, but I'm nearly 60, so being fairly old-fashioned is okay, I feel.
Thanks for answering the unanswerable question there, Nick, or at least making a good stab at it. And I'm often struck myself about this issue around the past, and I joke with some of the students that I teach and with my own teenage daughters that there's almost no differentiation between the ancient past and the recent past. It's almost as if the ancient Rome and the 1970s are equally distant for them. So I'm always fascinated by those questions, those kinds of questions. Thanks for that. The next question is for Michael, and it's from Hannah. And that's the second one for Nick. I'll leave that one. Sorry about that. The one for Michael is also from Hannah, another Hannah actually. Sorry, that's why I was getting confused. What facilities could be employed to enhance teachers and students' creation or design of their own curriculum? And that's obviously something you're very interested in, Michael.
Yeah. I think it depends on the context that you're in, but in a way the beauty of like language education in the context of kind of teaching people how to kind of use English more effectively is that in a way that opens up the field to deal with quite a few things, because there's no fixed curriculum as such. It's not like biology, or it's not like kind of mathematics or history, where there might be a syllabus. I mean, you get English for academic purposes, English for specific purposes, where things are often quite constrained. But to address the question directly, I think that teachers, teacher educators, and students should encourage each other to subvert curricula where they're not helpful. So we often used to talk about the fact that we knew we had to do certain things, but actually we wanted to try and do other things as well. And for example, bringing in our own resources, whether that be photographs, whether it be experiences, life experiences, to bring our own identities into the classroom. Now that sounds a bit woolly, but what I mean by that is simply we are human beings, and we have a right to a voice, and our experience is valuable, and actually we can use that to enhance language learning in various ways. So I think to open up the space really, and for teachers to work with students in order to generate their own curricula. And I think that the space is open for us to either do that you know, within constraints, but also to kind of, you know, to recognize that there are constraints and to subvert those where possible. So I think it has to be part of teacher education, and it's not just to be left to activist teachers. It's got to be, you know, people have to work with teachers to discuss things and to think about ways in which we can do that, and to decide what we want to do with those resources. So not just bring in your own resources, put your own topics on the table, but what do we want to talk about? What do we want to do? How are we going to create our own curriculum? Or how are we going to shoehorn it in somehow? So that sounds a bit general, a bit vague, but tasks and resources are things that can be brought into the classroom by students as well as teachers.
Thank you for that, Michael. I mean, there's never been such an important time for teachers and students to seize the curriculum initiative, I don't think, with the Black Lives Matter movement, decolonising the curriculum, and equally important, the climate change education agenda.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. There are no questions in the Q&A for Adam, but there's one that I think is aimed at you, Adam, in the chat. So I'm going to assume that it is, because it seems to relate most closely to your input. And this comes from Colette and says, are we allowed to have academic curiosity?
I'm just reflecting on that. It made me think that it might be a feature of the neoliberal university, this need to specialize, to be very calculated, to have like a, you know, a clearly thought out research project for the next 5 years or something. And I feel that, yeah, this idea of curiosity, which is what research should all be about, which ironically enough, for me is more of a feature of being a working class academic, where you keep that kind of impish childishness alive, you know, that interest of just wanting to try new things, not wanting to be shackled or constrained. And it seems that the neoliberal university, it really is, it kind of contradicts that in the sense that you have to sort of sell yourself and kind of forsake your identity a little bit in order to actually mold yourself into that, which is why I do often feel quite a tension between that. You know, there's the idea that you have to play the game. And by playing the game, then you do sort of lose that curiosity. But I think there is a way to find a balance between playing the game and keeping your curiosity. Which I just want to add, which is why this conference is such a great thing, because before I've been operating in such a sort of individualistic way that on my own, I'm very much surrounded by middle-class people and feeling very much like a fish out of water. And then this kind of initiative for me is fantastic, because it means that first, you're not alone. And secondly, a lot of the things that people are talking about fit together. You know, like the punk and then the punk bricoleur, like just putting those two things together, it's kind of fantastic, you know? So I think for me, it comes back to can't be done on your own. It very much is about collectivizing, being a group.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that connection, Adam, you just made there between yours and Michael's inputs is a very important one. And I think that's a theme that runs throughout working class academics. I this time last year, when I was in your position, I felt it's the most empowering thing I've ever been involved with that was work related, or not that much work related to me actually these days, but interest related. Yeah, so thanks for making that connection. We've got about 4 minutes left, and I have got 2 more questions. So if I can, and there's one of these is for Alex and one is for Nick. So I'll ask you to be very, very brief, if you both would. Alex, your question comes from Kevin, Kevan, I should say. Do you think there will come a time when people realise that slogans to tempt you to buy something that are special are merely because they merely taste better than something else, are simply a smoke screen to hide how much profit that they are making?
Well, yeah, I think if we train our minds, we get good at recognizing things. I'm very interested in Michael's, actually thoroughly enriched by all the presentations. But Michael was talking about language. Language shapes the way we think. You know, Orwell spoke about this. The language we use determines it can determine how we act. So yes, if we analyze and train ourselves to understand the messages and how they impact on our actions, and get back to meaningful language, and fast from these slogans. Use an ad blocker. We have to develop tactics. We have to protect the things that keep humanity humane, my feeling is. So be bricoleurs, remember public good,
And
and be punk, yeah.
Thanks for that, Alex. And the final question goes to Nick, and it is, in fact, from the same Hannah who asked a question to Michael earlier on, not a different Hannah, as I said earlier. And Hannah's question for Nick is, how pedagogical practices can be interpreted in the curriculum to fit different students' classes and needs?
Wow, I've got
I think that means how can they? Yeah. Another easy one, Nick.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry, there's no easy answer to that. I mean, so if we took my suggestion about teaching the Rugged Trouser Philanthropist to everybody, we'd have to say then, well, not everybody's going to find this book particularly easy to relate to. Some people may well do. Some people may well understand. There are plays, there are film versions of it as well that might help and aid people's understandings. One of the things that's really I find really difficult is that because of this sort of presentism of the time which we kind of live in, that when presented with things from the past, people automatically feel that it's alien and that somehow it's got very little to do with them. So if you were teaching Ragged Trouser the Philanthropist in Hastings, where Robert Tressel was when he wrote the book, there's an obvious way in there. If you were teaching working class children, there's a way to maybe link it into labour history. And if you're teaching people who are not working class, didn't identify, what you then have to I think that is where the idea of the common good would sort of come in, that ultimately this was a contribution to an idea of the common good. And that this has inspired later struggles. It's been passed down over kind of families and so on, and it literally helped build a lot of the institutions that we have today. So yes, different localities, different class experiences are going to have, that book would have to be activated in different sorts of ways, but I still feel it's something that could potentially speak to everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. And that brings us right to 11:20, which is when we're due to finish. So I would just like to finish by saying thanks very, very much to all four of our presenters. And there's plenty of fuel for me. I'm about to embark or continue with a small piece of action research for Learning and Skills Research Network and the National Education Union locally. And I'll definitely be in touch with some of you in connection with that if you're willing to give me time. And then I finally would just like to say thank you very much to the four of you, and hand back over to Pete Shuki or Alex to turn off this session and go to a break, I think.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you, everybody.